I can't breathe. Please, just let me breathe. Those were the last words James Lawrence gasped as Officer Hale pinned him to the cold concrete, his hands cuffed behind his back, his life slipping away while his daughter watched in horror. He begged for air for his inhaler, but the officers ignored him, just like they ignored every cry for help. His inhaler, simple, life-saving device, lay forgotten in the car, left behind like his life didn't matter. By the time they'd realized their mistake, it was too late. James was gone, and Daniel Harper didn't flinch. He didn't scream, he didn't cry. He just stared, cold, hard, and empty, as the world crumbled around him. This wasn't just about the loss of a father, it was about a system that let him die. So, Daniel didn't call for justice, he hunted it. One by one, the cops who stood by would pay. No warnings, no notes, no trace. The world would never see them coming. This is the story of how the silence of one man's death would shatter the lives of everyone who let it happen. Daniel Harper hadn't seen the flashing lights of a police car in years. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. His wife Leah was baking in the kitchen, her laughter echoing through their small house. Their daughter, Katie, sat on the floor, playing with her dolls as the evening sun set gently over the horizon. The air felt light, warm with comfort, the kind that only a family at peace can enjoy. But that peace shattered the moment Daniel heard the distant sound of sirens. The wail grew louder as the patrol car stopped outside their house. He couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settle over him, a feeling he couldn't explain but had learned to trust over the years. Something wasn't right. Leah's voice cracked through his thoughts, her worried gaze fixed on the window. "What's going on, Daniel?" He stood up from the chair, his heart racing, though he couldn't put his finger on why. He walked toward the door, his feet heavy on the floor as if the world was slowing down. Stepping outside, his breath hitched as he saw two officers approach the porch, Officer Hale and Officer Grant, both looking serious, like they were there for something far beyond a simple traffic stop. "Good evening, Mr. Harper," Officer Hale said, his voice cold but not unfriendly. "We need to speak with your father-in-law, James." Daniel's brow furrowed. "James, what's this about? Is he okay?" He glanced at his father-in-law, James Lawrence, who was standing at the edge of the driveway. He looked tired, older than his 75 years. His frame hunched as he tried to walk slowly towards them, holding his cane tightly in his right hand. "He's fine, for now," Officer Grant replied, though his tone didn't match his words. "We just need to ask him a few questions." Daniel felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Why him? Why now? "He was involved in an altercation earlier today," Officer Hale replied, almost dismissively. "Nothing serious, but we need to make sure everything is in order. Just a routine check." James, who had always been a man of few words, remained silent. His pale face looked as if it were already drained of color, but his eyes were sharp, watching the officers closely. Daniel felt a pang of unease. The officers' presence was unnerving, more than it should have been. There was something about the way they moved, too precise, too methodical. They weren't just asking questions, they were preparing for something. "James," Daniel said softly, his voice steady but full of concern. "Are you okay to talk to them?" James glanced at him, his face etched with anxiety. He nodded, his hands shaking slightly. "I'm fine, son. Just a misunderstanding. Nothing to worry about." The officers gestured for James to step toward the car, and as he did, Daniel saw a slight hitch in his father-in-law's movement. His breathing seemed labored, though Daniel hadn't noticed it before. James stopped halfway between the porch and the squad car, and that's when it happened. Everything changed in an instant. Officer Hale grabbed James roughly by the arm. "Come on, Mr. Lawrence, let's make this quick." Leah called out from the door, "Daniel, what's going on?" But before Daniel could respond, he heard his father-in-law gasp. "Please, I can't." James's voice trailed off as the officer shoved him forward, his legs buckling beneath him. The officers didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they didn't care. They dragged James to the car, forcing him against the side, his cane slipping from his grasp, falling to the ground with a sharp clatter. "James," Daniel shouted, rushing forward. "What are you doing to him? He can't walk properly. Let him go." Officer Grant stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Back up, Mr. Harper, he's just fine. He's getting a little too worked up, that's all." Daniel stood still, his chest tightening with fear. He could see his father-in-law's labored breathing, could see the way he winced with every step. "He's not fine." Daniel's voice rose in panic. "He needs his inhaler. He can't breathe properly without it." The officers paused, exchanging glances that told Daniel everything he needed to know. They didn't care. "You'll be fine, Mr. Lawrence, Officer Hale said, his words patronizing. Just calm down. But James's face had already turned pale, his lips tinged with blue. His hands shook as he tried to raise them to his chest, gasping for air. Please, my inhaler, James wheezed, his voice barely above a whisper. Leah screamed from the porch, her voice breaking. James, you can't leave him like that. He needs his inhaler. But Officer Hale just stared blankly at her. Ma'am, step back. Your father's fine. We're just trying to do our job here. Daniel's heart raced as he saw his father-in-law's body start to slump, his knees giving way beneath him. He reached out, trying to catch him, but the officers quickly pulled him away. No, let me help him, Daniel cried, his voice frantic. He's dying. You're killing him. The officer didn't respond, just continued to force James down onto the ground as if he were nothing more than a nuisance. The officers weren't even looking at James anymore, their eyes focused on the scene around them, unaffected, unmoved. Minutes passed like hours. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. The horror of watching his father-in-law suffocate, inching closer with each shallow breath. He couldn't move, couldn't act, his limbs frozen with disbelief. Then, as if in slow motion, he saw the moment. James's breathing finally stopped, the faint rasp of air, followed by the silence that consumed everything. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, the world collapsing around him. His father-in-law was gone. Call an ambulance, Leah cried out, her voice high with panic. But it was too late. The officers stood over James's lifeless body, indifferent to the screams. No one moved to help. No one cared. The days after James's death were a blur. The funeral was a quiet affair, no pomp, no grand speeches, just a simple gathering of close family, the kind of somber event that could never honor the man who had been taken so violently. So Senselessly. Daniel stood by the casket, his eyes fixed on the steel gray of the casket, but his mind was far away, lost in memories of better days. He remembered when James had first entered his life, a towering figure of quiet strength. When he married Leah, he hadn't just gained a wife, he had gained a father-in-law who had shown him what it meant to be a man, what it meant to work hard and provide, to stand tall in the face of the world's challenges. James had taught him everything he knew about patience, how to withstand the weight of a difficult life, how to fight when it was worth it. But now, here he was, standing over a man who had been torn away by the very system that was supposed to protect him, the same system that had failed him and would fail anyone who dared ask for help when they needed it most. The funeral service was over in a whisper. The crowd dispersed quickly, and the haunting reality of the day settled in. Leah hadn't spoken since they left the cemetery, her face a mask of sorrow that Daniel could barely recognize. She had been a strong woman, a woman who had kept their home together through every storm, but now she seemed hollow, adrift in the same grief that clung to Daniel like a second skin. At night, the house that once felt so full of life was eerily quiet. The sound of Leah's soft breathing beside him should have been comforting, but it wasn't. It was just a reminder of what they had lost of the whole. That was now a permanent part of their lives. Daniel didn't sleep, not really. Every time his eyes closed, he saw James's face, the pain in his eyes as he gasped for air, his pleas unanswered, drowned out by the indifference of those who had sworn an oath to serve and protect. He could still hear James's last words, in his head, over and over. I can't breathe. Please, just let me breathe. Each time it felt like a weight on his chest, suffocating him slowly. Each time he felt the rage building, the quiet seed of vengeance being planted deep inside him. Leah had tried to talk to him. We need to be strong for Katie, she'd whispered one night, her voice trembling, as if she was trying to convince herself as much as him. James wouldn't want us to fall apart. But Daniel didn't want to be strong. He didn't want to be patient. He wanted something more than just grief and the hollow words of comfort people gave when they didn't know what else to say. He wanted justice. He wanted the system to feel the pain it had inflicted on his family. It wasn't until a week later, when the police released the report full of lies, omissions, and half-truths, that Daniel felt his world truly collapse. The report stated that James had died unexpectedly from complications related to his asthma. There was no mention of the officers, no mention of his inhaler lying forgotten in the dirt, no mention of the way they had dragged him to the ground like an animal. There was nothing. It was as though James had never existed at all. The grief Daniel had been carrying for days began to turn, slowly, into something darker. His sense of justice, which had once been so solid, now felt like a cruel joke. The system didn't care. It never had. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized it would never care. Not about James, not about Leah, not about him. The anger came next. It was like a slow burn that started deep in his gut and began to spread through his veins, poisoning everything. He would sit in the living room, his hands clenched into fists, his mind racing through the possibilities. There were so many ways to make them pay. He could call the lawyer, take them to court, but what was the point? What was the point of begging for justice from a system that had already failed? The thought of legal action, of courtroom battles, of endless red tape made his skin crawl. The thought of vengeance, however, felt right. It felt like justice, real justice, not the kind that came in the form of paperwork and delayed sentences, not the kind that made excuses for criminals in uniform. No, the kind of justice Daniel wanted was the kind that made people fear the consequences of their actions. He wanted the officers who had killed James to know what it felt like to lose everything. He wanted them to understand the emptiness of watching someone you love slowly die, helpless in front of you. Daniel's transformation wasn't sudden, but it was inevitable. He tried to talk to Leah again, tried to explain how the injustice had eaten him alive, how he couldn't rest until he made them pay. But Leah couldn't understand. She didn't have the same anger inside her that he did. She didn't feel the way the world had shifted under their feet, turning everything they once believed into a sick, twisted lie. "You don't have to do this," she pleaded, tears in her eyes. "It's not going to bring him back. It's not going to bring peace." But it wasn't about peace anymore. It wasn't about moving on. Daniel wasn't sure what it was about anymore, but he knew he couldn't let this go. He couldn't stand to let the world forget his father-in-law. Life had meant something, and in a world that had discarded him like trash, it was up to Daniel to make sure people knew the price of turning a blind eye to injustice. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel's quiet descent into vengeance continued. His job, his friends, even his daughter, nothing mattered anymore. He watched the news reports, waiting for something to change, but the world just moved on. The police officers who had taken his father-in-law's life were still walking free, still living their lives. The system still ran like clockwork, indifferent to the cries of the broken. But Daniel wasn't broken, not anymore. And then the first piece of the puzzle fell into place. He knew Officer Hale's routine. He knew where he lived, where he drank, where he spent his time. And for the first time since the night James had died, Daniel felt the fire inside him flare, bright and fierce. He didn't want to think about what he was doing. He didn't want to consider the consequences. He just wanted to make sure they felt it. Every second, every breath he took, every drop of blood that spilt, he would make them understand what it meant to kill someone and walk away without consequence. The man he had been, once a man who believed in the system, who believed in doing things the right way, was gone. In his place was something darker, something driven by a rage that could never be satisfied by anything other than the destruction of those who had wronged him. He stepped into the night, knowing that his transformation was complete. He was no longer Daniel Harper, the man who believed in justice. He was Daniel Harper, the man who would bring justice to his own hands, no matter the cost. The city was quieter than usual that night. The hum of the streets seemed distant, muffled by the heavy fog that rolled in from the river, shrouding the world in a veil of grey. Daniel Harper had always hated the fog. There was something about it that made the world feel uncertain, like you could move through it without truly being seen. But tonight, the fog felt different. Tonight it felt like a cloak, wrapping him in the darkness he had embraced. For weeks, Daniel had followed Officer Hale, learning his routines, his habits, watching from the shadows as the man went about his daily life with a nonchalance that infuriated him. Hale didn't seem to know that the world had changed, that his indifference had cost someone their life. But Daniel was watching. Tonight was the night. It had taken time to piece everything together. Hale's weak spots, his vulnerabilities, the places he frequented when he thought no one was paying attention. The more Daniel learned, the more he realized just how easy it would be to make him pay. Hale was a creature of habit. He drank at the same bar every Thursday night, a dingy little place tucked behind a row of shops near the edge of town. No one special went there. It was a place where cops could relax, let their guard down, and pretend that they were just regular men. Tonight, Daniel was going to show Hale that he wasn't just a regular man. Not anymore. Daniel sat in the car, parked across the street from the bar, the engine off but the headlights casting a dim light on the wet pavement. His fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. His eyes never left the entrance to the bar, watching as people came and went, their figures blurred in the fog. He'd been here for an hour already, watching Hale's car parked outside, waiting for the man to come out, to make his move. Every breath Daniel took felt heavier than the last, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on his chest like a vice. But there was no turning back now, not after everything. Not after what Hale had done to James. As the minutes ticked by, Daniel felt his heartbeat slow, a strange calm settling over him. His mind was sharp, focused, calculating. He had planned for this moment, every step, every detail. There could be no mistakes. He wasn't just taking a life tonight, he was ending the indifference that had stolen everything from him. The door to the bar opened. Hale stumbled out, laughing with two other officers, their voices muffled in the fog. He was drunk. Daniel could tell from the way he swayed on his feet, his shoulders slumped, the way his laughter echoed too loudly in the night. He looked like a man who had forgotten the weight of his actions, someone who didn't know what it felt like to carry the consequences of his choices. Daniel's jaw tightened. He'd let the man drink, let him relax, let him think everything was fine, but it wasn't fine. And tonight, he was going to make sure Hale remembered that. Daniel stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at his skin, but he barely noticed it. He moved with purpose, his steps quiet, his body tense with anticipation. His hand brushed against the cold metal of the gun at his side, and he felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. This was it. The first strike. Hale and his two companions were still laughing, walking away from the bar toward their cars, unaware of the figure moving silently in the shadows. Daniel stayed close, just out of sight, his movements precise, calculated. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't need to be. The plan was simple: catch Hale alone, put an end to this, and walk away without anyone knowing he was ever there. The officers reached their cars, the conversation dying down as they fumbled with keys and doors. Hale was last, staggering slightly, his hand brushing the hood of his car as he tried to unlock it. Daniel saw his chance. He moved swiftly, silently, closing the distance between them in a matter of seconds. The fog swallowed him whole, leaving only the sound of his breath and the pounding of his heart in his ears. When Hale opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, Daniel was right there, his hand on the doorframe before the officer could slam it shut. Hale froze, eyes wide with surprise, but before he could react, Daniel's gun was pressed against his temple. The scent of alcohol on Hale's breath mingled with the sharp tang of fear in the air. "Get out of the car." Daniel's voice was steady, colder than he felt inside. Now Hale blinked, his mind clearly struggling to process what was happening. "What the hell is this? What do you want from me?" Daniel didn't flinch. "I want you to understand the weight of your actions. I want you to feel the consequences of what you did. You took something that wasn't yours, something that didn't belong to you. And tonight, you're going to learn what it feels like to lose everything." Hale opened his mouth, probably to say something else, but Daniel didn't give him the chance. With one swift movement, he yanked Hale out of the car, his hand still gripping the gun, pushing the officer against the cold metal of the vehicle. "Lawrence," Daniel said, his voice low and filled with fury. "You remember him, don't you? He begged for his inhaler. He begged for air, for help. And you," Daniel's voice cracked, but he steadied himself, forcing the words through clenched teeth. "You left him to die. You let him suffocate while you stood there, too damn busy to care. You killed him." Hale's face shifted. Fear, recognition, the realization that his life was about to end, not in some quiet hospital bed, but here, in the middle of the street, at the hands of a man he had wronged. Daniel could see the officer's legs tremble as he tried to stand firm. "I didn't," Hale started, but Daniel's grip on his collar tightened, cutting him off. "You did," Daniel interrupted, his voice a whisper of cold fury, "and now you're going to pay for it." There was no hesitation. Daniel had known what he was going to do the moment he set foot outside his car, the moment he made the decision to end this. He wasn't some vigilante with a cause. He was a man who had been wronged, a man whose grief had transformed into something else entirely. There was no place for mercy in this. Not tonight. The shot was clean, quick, and silencing. Hale's body crumpled against the car with a sickening thud, and Daniel stood there for a moment, the weight of what he had just done settling over him. It was over. The first strike had been made. He took a slow, steady breath, his hand still shaking, but his mind was clearer than it had been in days. The grief that had consumed him no longer. It had turned to something else, something colder, harder, more final. There would be no turning back now. The hunt had begun. Daniel turned and disappeared into the fog, leaving Officer Hale lying lifeless in the street. Just another casualty in a war he had never asked for but now couldn't escape. The days after the first strike were a blur of tension and quiet dread. Daniel didn't let up. He couldn't. Every move, every step was calculated. But the city didn't change. The streets still bustled, the world still turned, and the system continued to function as if nothing had happened. The first officer was dead, but to the rest of the world, it was just another tragic loss. another casualty of the chaos of the city. But for Daniel, this wasn't over, not even close. As he sat in the small office of his apartment, his laptop flickering in front of him, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. He had learned from the first kill, learned how to slip through the cracks of the system undetected. He had watched Officer Hale fall, but he knew this wasn't a simple case of street justice. This was bigger. This was the failure of a system that wasn't designed to protect people like his father-in-law. It was a system that protected its own, and in that system, there were more than just a few bad apples. Daniel's hands shook slightly as he opened the files, the ones that had been passed to him from his anonymous source. An envelope had arrived at his doorstep 2 days after Hale's death, containing a stack of papers that detailed the cover-up surrounding James Lawrence's death. The more he read, the more the weight of the corruption crushed him. He could already feel the sickness inside him growing, the rage turning into something darker. The police reports were riddled with lies. There was no mention of James's inhaler, no mention of the officers who had refused him help, the ones who had ignored his pleas for air. There was no mention of the struggle, of the moment when James had begged for his life, a moment that Daniel knew had been brushed aside. Instead, the official report claimed that James had simply collapsed due to medical complications, never revealing that those complications had been made worse by the officer's negligence. The deeper he dug, the more the truth began to unfold. There was an organized silence within the department, a protection of the officer's actions that ran all the way to the top. The higher-ups had done everything in their power to bury the truth, to protect their own at all costs. The officers involved in James's death had been shielded, their names kept hidden, their actions erased from the record, and the people who should have known the truth, Daniel, the family, had been left in the dark, fed lies by the very people who were supposed to serve and protect. Daniel couldn't breathe. The rage surged again, tightening his chest, his fists clenched so hard that his nails bit into his palms. He had hoped, foolishly, that the system would step in and correct the wrongs that had been done. But the more he uncovered, the more he realized just how much the system was designed to protect itself, to keep everything covered up, to make sure nothing ever reached the light. The internal corruption spread like cancer, infecting every level of the department, and as Daniel's hands moved over the documents, he found names of officers who had been involved in past misconduct, names of those who had been quietly moved from one precinct to another, their transgressions overlooked, their actions covered up. These were not isolated incidents. This was how the system worked. It wasn't just about Hale. It wasn't just about the officers who had been at the scene of James's death. The entire structure had failed them, and Daniel wasn't going to let it slide. But the more he dug, the more danger he found himself in. The fear inside the police department was palpable. Rumors spread like wildfire after Hale's death. It wasn't just the officers who were worried. Everyone in the department was on edge. The news was filled with whispers of a vigilante, someone targeting cops who were involved in misconduct. They didn't know who it was yet, but the fear was real. And with every passing day, the grip of tension tightened around the precincts. Daniel could almost taste it. He'd become a shadow now, slipping through cracks, watching the officers who had failed his family, watching them squirm as they realized they weren't as untouchable as they had once believed. One evening, as he was sitting in his car, parked several blocks away from the police headquarters, he noticed something that made his stomach twist. It was a small group of officers gathered on the street corner, their voices low and anxious as they glanced around nervously. Daniel's eyes narrowed. They were talking about him. They didn't know it yet, but they were starting to realize the truth, that someone was watching them. Someone was picking them off one by one. He knew what this meant. The fear had set in. They were starting to protect themselves now, creating their own barriers, their own circles of silence. The whispers of retaliation, the fear of being the next targeted, was spreading like wildfire. And every time one of them looked over their shoulder, every time they double-checked the locks on their doors, Daniel felt that familiar satisfaction stir inside him. The first strike had been clean, quick, and efficient. But this was different. This wasn't just about killing a cop. It was about sending a message. It was about showing the officers that they couldn't hide behind their badges anymore, that they weren't invincible. The silence around Daniel's movements was growing, but so was the fear inside the police department. The more they tried to cover up, the more Daniel uncovered. The more they tried to keep their secrets hidden, the more he exposed, and the deeper the corruption ran, the more desperate the officers became. They knew the retaliation wasn't over. They knew that if they didn't silence him soon, he would continue tearing down the walls they'd spent years building. But Daniel wasn't going to stop. Not until they paid. Not until everyone who had turned a blind eye to his father and death felt the cold weight of justice. As the days passed, the walls of corruption seemed to grow higher, the silence louder. The system that had failed James was now doing everything it could to protect its own. But Daniel was no longer just a man grieving his loss. He was a man on a mission, and he wasn't afraid of the fear that was beginning to spread among the cops. He welcomed it. The tension was rising. The officers were starting to crack under the pressure. The web of corruption was slowly being unraveled, and Daniel was just getting started. The tension in the air was thick with something Daniel couldn't quite name. The days had bled into one another since Officer Hale's death, and the city was still holding its breath. News reports called it a tragic event, but they were careful with their words. They said it was a random act of violence, as if Hale had been just another victim of the chaos of the streets. The truth was, the police were starting to see the pattern: one officer dead, the next one marked. Daniel knew they were scared. He could feel it in the way the officers moved, in the hushed tones of their conversations. They were beginning to close ranks, to watch each other with suspicion, but it wasn't enough. They hadn't learned, not yet. And Daniel's work was far from finished. His eyes stayed fixed on the file in front of him. This wasn't just about avenging his father-in-law anymore. This was personal. This had become something darker, something that consumed him more each day. The revenge was no longer just for James, it was for him, for Leah, for the loss of their family. Each death felt like a weight on his soul, and yet, he couldn't stop, couldn't look away. This time, it wasn't going to be the same as Hale's death. This time, Daniel wasn't going to make it quick. The second kill was going to be different, more personal, more intimate. He had spent the last week tracking Officer Briggs. She had been one of the officers who had participated in the initial cover-up of James's death. She was methodical, cold in her approach, and no one knew her routine better than Daniel. The hours she spent alone in her apartment, the late-night coffee runs, the trips she made to her mother's house. She was predictable, in a way, but that was the danger. Daniel sat in the shadows outside her building, the faint glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. His breath came slow and measured, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him, but he ignored it. The fear that used to rise in his chest with each new act of vengeance was gone now. There was no hesitation, only resolve. It had taken time to get to this point, time to learn the details, to let the anger build. The first strike had been clean, efficient, but this time Daniel wasn't just going to kill her. He was going to make her feel the same terror, the same helplessness that James had felt, the same terror Leah had felt when she realized her father was dying, and no one cared. Briggs didn't know it yet, but she was being watched. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he saw her figure moving past the window of her apartment, oblivious to the storm that was closing in on her. He had planned it down to the last detail. He knew she had a habit of going for a run every night at 11 p.m. It was something she did to unwind after the stress of the day. Her way of pretending everything was normal. Daniel had been there when she started this routine weeks ago, tracking her movements, watching her run through the darkened streets, her headphones blocking out the world around her. It had become a ritual, a pattern he knew would bring her to the same spot tonight. The second kill was going to be slower. He would wait for her to run by, make sure no one was around. Then he would make his move. He'd keep it simple, choke her out, just like she had choked the life out of James with her indifference. He would show her what it felt like to be powerless, to lose control of your own fate. Daniel's hand shook as he checked his watch. It was almost time. His heart drummed in his chest, but it wasn't fear. It was something else, something cold, something far more dangerous. The more he thought about it, the less it felt like vengeance. It felt like justice, like something that needed to be done. Like the world wouldn't be right until he made them understand what it meant to kill someone and walk away without consequence. He stepped out from his hiding place, moving with the kind of quiet grace that only came from years of training he had long since abandoned, replaced by something much darker. As he moved through the alleys, his mind raced with the thought of what was to come. This was the moment. There was no going back. Briggs was approaching now, her footsteps light against the pavement. She had no idea. Her pace was steady, and for a brief moment, she looked calm, almost peaceful, as though she were just another person taking a jog at night. Daniel watched her for a moment longer, a cold smile pulling at his lips. She thought she was safe, but she wasn't. Not tonight. As she passed by, he emerged from the shadows. The movement was fluid, practiced. His hands found her neck almost instinctively, tightening around her throat, cutting off her breath. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of her gasps, her attempts to break free, her hands clawing. At his grip, she struggled, kicking and fighting, but Daniel didn't let go. He didn't need to. He had waited too long for this, and now it was his time to take control. Her eyes were wide with terror as she gasped for air, but Daniel's expression remained emotionless. This wasn't about the physical act of killing anymore. This was about something deeper, something that couldn't be undone. Every second she struggled, every breath she tried to take, was a moment of retribution, a moment of justice for James, for Leah, for everything he had lost. The struggle didn't last long. Her body went limp in his arms, the fight draining out of her as she slipped into unconsciousness. He held her there for a few more seconds, just to make sure it was over. He didn't want any last-minute surprises. When he was certain, he dropped her body to the ground like a rag doll. Daniel stood over her, his chest heaving, but there was no relief, no sense of satisfaction. There was only the quiet hum of the city, the distant sounds of life continuing as though nothing had changed. But for Daniel, everything had changed. He wasn't just a man seeking revenge anymore. He was something else, something darker. He wiped his hands on his pants and turned to leave, but before he did, he glanced back one last time. He didn't feel the weight of guilt, the way some might have expected. No, he felt only the growing satisfaction that he had done what needed to be done. The second kill was over. The message was clear. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk in front of him. His mind was clear, focused, the way it always had been before he went on the hunt. The news had carried the weight of the second kill like a flash of lightning, quick and sharp. Officer Briggs was dead, her body found just after dawn, her life snuffed out in the dark alley she had jogged through every night. The reports stated foul play, suspected, but Daniel knew better. He knew what had happened, just as he knew that the city was on edge. The cops were starting to panic. The police didn't know it yet, but they were getting closer. Their investigations were becoming more focused, more deliberate. Daniel had been careful, he always was. He didn't leave a trace. But even the most careful plans had cracks. His growing sense of unease wasn't about the kill itself, but about what came after. The hunt for him was only just beginning. He had been following the case in the news, reading every article, watching every broadcast. The police had started connecting the dots. Officer Hale's death wasn't an isolated incident, and now, with Briggs gone, the officers were beginning to feel the pressure. Their lives were spiraling into chaos. They couldn't shake the fear that someone, somewhere, was picking them off one by one. There were whispers in the precincts, rumors that circulated in hushed tones. Everyone was talking about the vigilante, the phantom who had somehow evaded capture after taking down 2 cops with cold precision. Daniel wasn't sure why it had taken them this long to connect the dots. It was all so simple: 2 cops, dead, in quick succession, both tied to a corrupt system. They were both involved in the cover-up surrounding his father-in-law's death, but the authorities were still fumbling in the dark. They didn't know who was behind it, but they knew they had a problem on their hands. As he flipped through the case files again, Daniel's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together. Officer Briggs's death had sent shockwaves through the department. The cops knew that the pattern couldn't be ignored. The investigation had escalated. There were more officers assigned, more resources thrown at the case. The police were starting to panic, their grip on the investigation slipping as they realized that they were being hunted, not by criminals, but by someone who had once been one of them. Daniel had been methodical, but even his precision couldn't keep the walls from closing in. He knew the police were piecing things together. They were already starting to question the oddities of the 2 murders, how clean they were, how perfectly executed, a trace of something that wasn't quite right, a missing piece. They were already looking at the officers involved in the cover-up of James's death, their suspicions growing with each passing day. But what they didn't know was how deep the corruption ran. They hadn't figured out that the vigilante wasn't just targeting random cops. No, Daniel wasn't a random killer. This was personal, and the cops had no idea who they were really dealing with. The pressure was starting to build, the tension was palpable, and it wasn't just in the precinct. It was in the streets, in the air. The fear was infectious. Daniel could sense it, feel it in the way the cops carried themselves when they walked down the street, the nervous glances they cast over their shoulders. But he remained calm. He had to. He couldn't let the fear of getting caught cloud his judgment. He had a purpose, a mission that kept him focused, kept him moving forward. The police were closing in, but they still hadn't figured him out. It was becoming more difficult to keep up the charade of normalcy. Leah hadn't asked about the second death. She didn't need to. She had seen the way he was when Hale died, distant, detached. But she wasn't blind. She saw the way Daniel was changing, how his grief had morphed into something harder, something colder. His eyes had lost their softness. the humanity that had once defined him slipping away as the weeks passed. The man who had walked into the police station on that dark night, ready to beg for justice, was no longer there. In his place stood something darker, more detached. There were times when Daniel's mind would wander, when the weight of what he had done would hit him all at once. Those were the moments that tested him. He couldn't stop now, he couldn't back out. Not after everything he had learned, after everything he had uncovered. The truth about how James had died, the corruption that had buried his death beneath. It all ran too deep. The police didn't just ignore James's pleas for help. They had buried him, erased him from the records. The system that was supposed to protect them had done nothing but protect itself. And Daniel couldn't let that go. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he was becoming something he never imagined. His mind wasn't just focused on revenge anymore. He wasn't seeking justice in the traditional sense. He wasn't trying to bring the officers involved to trial. He wasn't trying to fix the system. He had stopped believing that the system could be fixed. This was something else. Something darker, something that was beyond justice. And with each death, each kill, he could feel himself slipping further into the abyss. His phone rang, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. He stared at the screen for a moment, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the name. It was from an old contact, someone who had given him information on the officers involved. In the cover-up, he picked up the phone, his voice steady as he spoke. "Daniel." The voice on the other end was low, tense. "You're still on their radar. They're getting closer. The pressure is building." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. He could hear the fear in the man's voice, the desperation. It wasn't just the cops who were scared. It was everyone involved in the cover-up. They were starting to realize that they weren't safe anymore. The veil of silence they had used to protect themselves was unraveling. "I know," Daniel replied quietly. "But they still don't know who's doing this. They're close, but not close enough. They're watching everyone, Daniel. The investigation's spreading. You need to be careful." Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the wall, his mind working quickly. "I'm not stopping. Not now. They made this personal. They'll regret it." The line went silent for a moment before the voice came back, quieter now. "Just be careful. You don't know what's coming." Daniel ended the call and sat there for a long moment, letting the words sink in. The police were closing in, but they still had no idea who he was. He was still ahead of them, but the fear in the voice on the other end of the line had stirred. Something in him, something he hadn't expected to feel. That fear, real fear. He wasn't just running from the cops anymore. He was running from something else, the dark side of himself that he had created with every life he had taken. But it was too late to turn back. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and now, there was nothing left but to see how far this would go. The air in the city had changed. The tension was palpable, thick like smoke hanging over the streets, wrapping around everything in its path. Daniel could feel it in the way the police moved now, nervous glances, quick steps, furtive conversations in dark corners. They were getting desperate. They were closing in, but they still had no idea who was really behind it all. The third target was different. It wasn't just about the officers who had been involved in James's death. This time, Daniel was going after someone higher up. Captain Monroe was a figure of power in the police department, a man whose hands were deep in the corruption that had allowed James to die. Monroe wasn't just a cop. He was a part of the system that had protected its own, that had turned a blind eye when Daniel had needed help. And now Daniel had made it personal. The plan was simple enough. Monroe had a house upstate, a retreat where he went to escape the pressures of his job. Daniel had learned about it weeks ago, a quiet place where Monroe could unwind, far from the eyes of his colleagues, far from the chaos he helped create. But what Daniel didn't count on was how close the net was getting. He was being watched now. He knew it. He had to be smarter, more careful than ever. He spent the night watching Monroe's movements, following him from the precinct, tracking him to the secluded house he had so carefully built for himself. The house was tucked away in the woods. Isolated, it was the perfect place for someone trying to hide from the world. And yet, Daniel knew there was nowhere to hide from what was coming. Monroe's house was dark, the only light coming from a single lamp near the front door. Daniel had already studied the layout, already marked the windows and the entrances. It was the perfect setup, the kind of place where someone could slip in and out without a trace. But even as he approached, his heart pounded in his chest, a low, steady rhythm that echoed in his ears. This was it, the third kill, and it was going to be the most dangerous one yet. Daniel's footsteps were silent against the cold grass. Each step a calculated risk. The house loomed ahead of him like a fortress, the stillness surrounding it making everything feel more fragile. The plan was clear: get in, get Monroe, and get out. No mess, no chaos. But Daniel had learned from the past that nothing was ever that easy. He moved swiftly toward the back of the house, where the sliding door stood half open, a faint glow coming from inside. Monroe had never been the cautious type, it seemed. The door was locked, but Daniel had learned long ago how to break in without making a sound. He slipped inside, his body tense, the cool air of the house wrapping around him like a shroud. Interior was just as he'd expected: neatly furnished, expensive. Monroe had made his wealth off the backs of people like James, and Daniel could feel the weight of that injustice hanging in the air. Every step he took felt heavier, each room another reminder of how deep the rot went. But Daniel wasn't here for revenge anymore. He was here for something darker, something that had consumed him over the last few weeks. Monroe was in the study, sitting at his desk, pouring himself a drink. He hadn't heard Daniel enter, too focused on the glass in his hand, too consumed by his own arrogance. Daniel didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, silent as a shadow, and the sound of the gun cocking seemed to fill the room. Monroe froze, his fingers stilling on the glass. For a moment, there was only the sound of his breath. "Don't move." Daniel's voice was steady, cold. Monroe's eyes darted around the room, his hand inching toward the drawer of his desk, where Daniel knew his gun was. But Daniel was faster. He took a step closer, the barrel of the gun aimed directly at Monroe's chest. "You're going to pay for what you did," Daniel said, his voice low, filled with quiet fury. "For every life you've ruined, for every person you've discarded, you're going to feel what it's like to lose everything." Monroe's face twisted into something between fear and anger, but he didn't speak. He didn't beg. He had learned, over the years, how to keep his composure in the face of adversity. But Daniel could see it in his eyes: the fear, the panic, that creeping realization that his time had come. "You think I'm the only one?" Monroe finally spoke, his voice shaky, his words an attempt at defiance. "You think you're the first to come after me? There are others who will." Daniel didn't let him finish. The gunshots rang out, loud and final, cutting through Monroe's words like a blade. The captain's body jerked, and he crumpled to the ground, his life draining out of him in a pool of red dot. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel stood over him for a moment, his eyes cold, watching as the life left Monroe's body. There was no satisfaction, no relief, just a hollow emptiness that had come to define his every action. He had crossed the line. There was no turning back now. The sound of Monroe's final breath, the moment when his life slipped away, stayed with Daniel. For a brief second he felt something, an emotion he couldn't quite place. Guilt, regret. No, it was the same thing he had felt after the first kill, after the second. Nothing had changed. He was no longer just a man seeking justice. He was something else. Something darker. But the work wasn't finished. It never would be. Daniel turned and walked out of the house, leaving Monroe's body behind. The fog outside had thickened, the world around him swallowed by darkness. The silence that had once felt oppressive now felt like a blanket, comforting in its stillness. He was moving forward, and nothing was going to stop him. As he disappeared into the night, Daniel knew one thing: the fear in Monroe's eyes had been real. The others would feel it too. They would all feel it. The third strike had been made, and the storm was just beginning. Daniel felt it in his bones. Before he saw it, before he heard the distant hum of sirens, before the distant echoes of footsteps outside his apartment, the net was closing in. The police had been looking for him for weeks, and now, after 3 strikes, it was only a matter of time before they found him. His actions, once meticulously calculated, were starting to unravel, slowly but inevitably. The hunt for the phantom vigilante had intensified after Monroe's death, and Daniel had known this would happen. Tonight, he was no longer just a man seeking vengeance. He was a shadow in a city that had begun to feel too small for his deeds. There were too many eyes, too many whispers. The police knew something wasn't right. They were getting closer, and Daniel knew it. He had moved from place to place, trying to keep ahead of them, but the apartment felt too tight tonight, the walls too close. It was too quiet. Every time a car drove by, every time someone knocked on a door, Daniel's muscles tensed, his fingers twitching towards the gun he'd been carrying. The fear, the constant pressure, it was starting to take a toll. His heart beat faster now, his mind raced, but the cold fury inside him hadn't. He stood at the window, staring out into the street below. The fog had rolled in again, the same heavy, suffocating fog that had followed him for weeks. It was like the city had become a ghost town, silent, anonymous, the streets stretching on forever with no end in sight. But tonight, the fog felt different. It was closing in around him, just as the police were. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. A message from the same anonymous source who had tipped him off about the officers, about the corrupt system. They're here, the precincts, watching, be careful. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't surprised. He had known it was only a matter of time before they found him. The hunt wasn't just about catching a killer anymore. It was about stopping the chaos he had unleashed, and they were getting desperate. But Daniel wasn't ready to stop. Not yet. Not while there was still more to be done. He checked the clock. It was just after midnight. The sirens were louder now, closer. He couldn't stay here. Not for long. He had made his bed, and now it was time to lie in it. The third kill had already drawn too much attention, and the closer he got to finishing his mission, the more he felt the pressure. The voices in his head had stopped being just whispers. They were shouts now, urging him to finish what he started. Daniel grabbed his jacket, pulled his gun from its holster, and moved towards the door. His breath felt shallow, his mind racing with thoughts of the last 3 weeks. The first kill was clean, quick. The second had been more intimate, more personal. But the third ... it had been a mistake in more ways than one. Monroe's death had been messy, much blood, too many risks. The police were catching up to him, and they weren't going to stop until they had him. But that wasn't going to be tonight. His phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't from the source. It was from Leah. He didn't even have to read the message to know what it said. Where are you? Her message was a reminder of everything he had left behind. Everything he had sacrificed. The man he had been before all of this. The man who had sat at the dinner table, laughing with his wife and daughter, not knowing the darkness that would take root in his soul. The man who had still believed in justice, who had trusted the system to do the right thing. But that man was gone now, and the man standing in front of the door, gun in hand, was something else entirely. He had become the very thing he had once despised. Daniel turned off his phone, silencing the message. He didn't have time for distractions. The police were outside. His time was running out. He stepped out into the hallway and closed the door. Behind him softly, his footsteps silent against the cold tiles of the apartment building. He moved quickly, his eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway. His breath came in shallow bursts, his body tensed, ready for anything. He had no plan now, no careful strategy. He was too far gone to worry about being caught. Daniel descended the stairs, quickly, his mind sharp, his senses heightened. He knew where they would be looking. The alleyways, the side streets. He had already planned his escape route, but as he reached the street, the harsh sound of police radios filled the air, drowning out the silence of the city. A squad car screeched to a halt just ahead of him, the headlights blinding in the fog. He froze. The moment had arrived. 2 officers stepped out of the car, their movements quick, their eyes scanning the area. Daniel knew they weren't here by chance. They were looking for him. He ducked behind a nearby building, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of the gun in his hand comforting and terrifying all at once. "Did you see anything?" one officer asked, his voice sharp, strained. "He's close. We need to catch him tonight." "No sign of him yet," the other officer replied. "But he can't keep running. We'll find him." Daniel's pulse quickened. They were getting closer, but he wasn't ready to go down. Not like this, not without a fight. He waited, his body pressed against the cold stone of the building, his breath shallow, waiting for the right moment. The officers moved down the alley, their radios crackling with updates. Their backs were turned, their attention focused elsewhere. It was his chance. His only chance. Daniel moved quickly, silently, the gun at his side. The officers were only a few feet away now. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of his decisions settling in his chest like a stone dot as he stepped forward. His foot brushed against a can. It clattered against the pavement, loud in the still night. The officers froze, their heads snapping toward the noise. Daniel didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the nearest exit, a small side street leading to the back of an old building. His legs burned, but he pushed himself harder, faster. He could hear the officers shouting behind him, their footsteps pounding on the ground. But he wasn't stopping, not tonight. As he turned the corner, he collided with something, a figure emerging from the shadows. His body tensed, his gun raised instinctively, but then he saw who it was. His breath caught in his throat. Leah stood in front of him, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Daniel, stop, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't know what to say. The moment seemed to stretch out before him, the world spinning as he looked at her, his wife, the person he had promised to protect. But that was before everything had changed, before the anger, before the grief, before the blood. "I can't stop," Daniel said, his voice flat, hollow. "Not now." Not after everything. Don't you see? Leah's voice cracked. You're losing yourself. This isn't who you are. This vengeance, not justice. But Daniel didn't hear her. He couldn't. His heart was numb, his thoughts clouded by the rage that had been building for weeks. This was bigger than just them now. It had become something he couldn't control. Leah reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his arm. Please, Daniel. You don't have to do this. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, the world spinning around him. The sirens were getting louder now. The officers were closing in. And Daniel was trapped, torn between the woman he loved and the monster he had become. But then the first of the officers appeared at the corner. Their eyes locked on Daniel, and he felt the reality of the situation hit him. There was no way out anymore. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. The sound of Leah's voice, the sirens, the breath in his chest, they all seemed distant, out of reach. His grip tightened on the gun, and he turned away from her, running into the night, leaving everything behind. The sound of sirens had long faded by the time Daniel reached the abandoned warehouse. The city was quiet now, suffocated by the weight of its own secrets. The fog had lifted, but the heavy, damp air still clung to everything, suffusing the streets with a sense of finality. His footsteps echoed in the empty streets, his breath shallow as he walked, a man caught between the past and the present. Unsure where to go from here, it was over. 3 lives taken, 3 names erased from the books, 3 officers complicit in the corruption that had swallowed his family gone. But the silence that followed felt anything but peaceful. It felt like a void, a chasm between what Daniel had hoped for and what he had actually become. The justice he had sought with such cold precision had been delivered, but it had come at a cost. The cost had been the man he had once been, the husband, the father, the man who still remembered the days when he believed in right and wrong, in the power of justice through the court. That man was gone now, buried beneath the bodies of those he had killed, suffocated by the weight of vengeance. He had become something else, something darker. The fear in Leah's eyes, the betrayal he had seen there, still haunted him. He moved, like a shadow now, disconnected from the world, his every step uncertain what was left for him after all of this. After everything he had lost, was there even a path back? Could he walk away from the darkness, or had it already swallowed him whole? The warehouse loomed in front of him, its tall windows cracked, its metal doors rusted and worn. It had been his hiding place for the last few weeks, a place where he could breathe without feeling the weight of eyes on him, without feeling the pressure of being hunted. But even here, even in this forsaken place, there was no peace, no release. Daniel stood at the entrance, staring into the dimly lit expanse of the warehouse, his heart pounding in his chest, unsure of what he was even looking for. The same uncertainty that had followed him since the first kill now gripped him tighter. It wasn't just about vengeance anymore. It was about the aftermath, the emptiness that followed the completion of his mission. He thought about the people he had left behind, Leah, Katie, the family that had once been the anchor to his soul. And yet, in the darkness of his mind, Daniel couldn't stop. The thirst for vengeance had taken on a life of its own, and no matter how much he had hoped for peace, there had been no peace in the killing, no satisfaction in watching his enemies fall. There was only the crushing weight of what he had become, a shadow of the man who had once believed in something greater. But the consequences of his actions had yet to catch up with him. The police were still hunting for him, and there would be no end to the pursuit. He knew that, and yet, there was something in him that couldn't let go. In the distance, the sound of a car pulling up broke the stillness. Daniel tensed, his body instinctively preparing for whatever came next. He didn't know whether this was at the moment when his fate caught up with him, but he knew it was close. His eyes scanned the street, narrowing as the headlights of a squad car cut through the darkness. He didn't run. Not this time. He had already run too much, hidden too much. His body was too tired, his spirit too drained to keep hiding. The car slowed, its tires screeching against the wet asphalt as it came to a stop a few feet away from him. 2 officers stepped out, their figures emerging from the shadows of the night like ghosts, their faces hard and determined. It was time. Daniel didn't move. He stood there, facing them, his hand still on the gun at his side. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, whether he wanted them to take him in or to end it all right here. He wasn't sure he cared anymore. Daniel Harper, the officer on the left, called, his voice firm, but not cold. You're under arrest for the murders of officers Hale, Briggs, and Monroe. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Daniel's heart raced, but his body remained still. The Cold steel of the gun felt heavy in his hand. The truth was, he had never intended to be caught, but in this moment, something inside him shifted. Maybe it was the exhaustion, the weight of the last few weeks. Maybe it was the realization that he had already crossed the line and couldn't go back. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the smallest, fleeting hope that there might be something left in him that was still human. He raised his hand slowly, the gun still held loosely in his grip, his fingers trembling not from fear but from the weight of his actions. The officers tensed, their hands hovering near their weapons, but they didn't move. Daniel could see the wariness in their eyes. They didn't know what he would do next, but neither did he. The air between them felt thick with the silence of unspoken truths, the weight of everything that had led to this moment pressing down on them all. For a moment, Daniel thought about putting the gun down, walking away, but that was the part of him that still clung to the hope of redemption, the part of him that was dying by the second. The other officer stepped forward, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it. "You've done it, Daniel. You've killed 3 cops. What do you think happens now? You think the system's gonna stop chasing you? You think this is over?" Daniel didn't answer. What could he say? He had killed them all. Hale, Briggs, Monroe. He had taken their lives in the name of justice, in the name of something he could no longer define. The anger had taken over him. Yes. But now he was left standing here, facing his own consequences. He wasn't the man he had been before. He wasn't even sure who he was anymore. The officer spoke again, a hint of pity in his voice. "You're a murderer, and no matter what you thought you were doing, no matter what you thought you were fixing, it doesn't change that." The words hit Daniel like a slap, but they didn't sting. Not anymore. He had already told himself the truth, over and over in the quiet of his mind. He had become the very thing he had sought to destroy. His thirst for vengeance had consumed him, and in the end, there would be no peace, no satisfaction, no justice, just the aftermath. And then, without thinking, Daniel dropped the gun. The weight of it left his hand, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a moment of clarity. The police closed in on him, their voices commanding, but they didn't need to move fast. Daniel didn't resist. His final moment of reckoning had come. His punishment, whether it came from the system or from his own conscience, was already in motion. The world had taken from him everything it could, and in return, he had taken everything from it. Now, it was over. But as they led him away, Daniel couldn't help but wonder, had he truly made things right? Or had he just dug himself deeper into the hole he had tried to escape? As they placed him into the back of the squad car, the reality of his choices began to settle over him, heavy and suffocating. There was no redemption, there was no justice, just a man who had been broken, piece by piece, until all that was left was the darkness. And as the car pulled away, Daniel felt the weight of it, all the weight of everything he had done. He had started this journey seeking justice, but somewhere, along the way he had lost sight of what that truly meant. The sirens wailed in the distance, fading as the city swallowed him whole.